Oh my goodness, I wanted to admire that thumbnail from Wes there. That was a good job, Wes. Look at that, y'all. Look at this. Sorry. Okay. I just needed a moment. That's cool. Good job, Wes. I mean, as always, making the great thumbnails. So grateful for him and all that he does for this show. Welcome to this edition of At the Mic. This is the Thursday Deep Dive. I'm your host, Keith Malinak. I will say that if you recall, a few weeks ago, we had some issues. X was getting hacked, and that was a big to-do, and we were scrambling to get on the air. And this week, the issue was StreamYard was down, and it's still down. And so I'm grateful for my resilient guest. I sent the backup link to her, so we're using that. So that's why things might look a little different here this week. But we're here, everybody, and that is so exciting. And I will say, I'm just full disclosure, you know, I like to overshare even with you, the audience. Matilda is currently at my feet right now, licking it. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to tolerate the puppy doing this. You got to stop, girl. Stop. Okay. So anyhow, I'm trying to get, is the chat up, y'all? Because things are different. And I really hope that you have that outlet. And if you don't, I apologize because I don't know what I'm doing. Let's put it that way. But hopefully the X chat has. So yeah, I see Lep over there. Okay, cool. All right, very good. All right, yay! Whew. We're gonna make it. We're gonna make it, y'all. So today's deep dive focuses on a little-known tragedy in American history. It's an event that until the last few years I knew nothing about, and I love history, and I can't wait to get into this conversation with you. And I mentioned Wes. Thank you to all that you do for this show, Hero Wes, with the thumbnails, and for he puts the show. Make sure that it's up later tonight, I think at 8 o'clock Eastern on YouTube and Rumble. And obviously tomorrow morning on Spotify, iTunes, the audio versions. I tell you, I'm going to get Matilda up here because stop. Oh, my goodness. Y'all got it. She's in here. She's lurking today and causing a ruckus down there. So thank you, Wes, to all you do. At themicshow.com is where you can find all of the links for this show. Thank you to Gabby for all that you do with the Instagram channel that you started on your own and you maintain it. You put great stuff over there. I'm so grateful for y'all. Don't forget, over on X, Wes is at that guy at PGU. Gabby is at Jeffy Apologist. I mean, these are two people that do Herculean things for this program, and they do it. They don't ask for anything. And I love them to death. And I'm so grateful. If you missed last week's deep dive, oh my goodness, it was a doozy with Ashton Forbes. We talked about missing Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. For 11 years, that plane has been missing, all traces of it. And he has just continued for several years now, continued to unlock doors to incredible technologies associated with that missing flight, and the mystery continues. So if you missed that, it's pinned to the top here with all the, I don't know what we counted up, 250 something different conversations we've had over the years, all pinned to the top here of the X page. So be sure to check that out as well, the complete archive, waiting for you to peruse it. Now, America's history is very complicated. There's a lot of good in our nation's history, and there's also a lot of darkness in our story as well. And oftentimes, the stories of America's darkest times, they don't see the light of day. They're buried. And one of those stories is today's topic, the Ludlow Massacre. I love driving out west. I tell you all this all the time. There's not one place in the Mountain Time Zone that I don't absolutely love. And I mean that. Like, I'm serious. Everywhere in the Mountain Time Zone, I absolutely love. I love the mountains, and I love history. And I end up in Colorado roughly every summer. Got to escape the heat from Texas whenever you can. And it was the summer of 2020. I was driving south on Interstate 25. I was getting close to Trinidad, Colorado. And there was this exit marker. And I was like, sure, I'll do this. Pull over there. Not a mile off the interstate is this ghost town. And I'll show you pictures that I've taken over the years. And it's Ludlow, Colorado. And there is a historic marker there, it's a solemn site for what happened there. And my guest will tell the story. but it's there in Ludlow, Colorado. And it is something that I had never heard of. And I was so pissed that I'd never heard of it either. And I'll let her tell the story, but it's there in Ludlow, Colorado, happened 111 years ago. And when you hear the story, you'll soon learn not only why it's important to the labor movement in America, but you also learn about one of America's terrible tragedies that was completely unnecessary. So I've talked enough. Let me get my guest in here. Dr. Fawn Amber Montoya from James Madison University. She's helped write this book and I know you're busy. Oh my goodness. I do know that you're busy, doctor, because you have, a good host would have already had your book cover ready. There it is. Communities of Ludlow. And I know that you're writing, you tell me what you're writing right now. Well,
sure. So this bit, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're great.
So this book that you see came out in 2022, and my colleague Karen Larkin and I worked on it for about 9 years. What I'm working on now, there's a couple of projects, but one is called Ghosts of the Past, and this book should come out in the next 2 years, but it's looking at really folklore of the Southwest, how names of different locations came to be. The other book that I'm working on, which we're just really starting, is probably going to be called Families of Ludlow. I'm working very closely with the United Mine Workers through a National Park Service grant. And we're starting to collect and expand on oral histories of the descendants of both survivors and victims of the Ludlow Massacre.
Okay. So where do you want to start this story? Because the event takes place in 1914, but it was something that was brewing long before that, correct?
Yeah, so the event can start in a couple of different points. The first one can start at the rise of the Second Industrial Revolution as the United States is growing because of the increase of electricity. You start having an increase of immigrant labor coming into the United States. This is after the U.S. war with Mexico. So the borderlands of the United States are sort of now become the United States rather than being attached to Mexico. You start seeing people migrating across the nation because of the railroad. And it really sort of starts after the U.S. war with Mexico when you have a man by the name of William Jackson Palmer, who is a geologist who will head to Colorado. And as he's visiting Colorado, he notices that along the Rocky Mountains or the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in southeastern Colorado, that it is an area where coal is present. So that's one place to start it. I also started much earlier than that this was native land, that it continues to be indigenous peoples of the region and descendants of these peoples that still migrate back and forth across this area. But it's native land. If you're heading north and you look to the west, you'll see the Spanish Peaks or the Oaxacoyas, which were part of the Sangre de Cristo range of the Rocky Mountains. And then that indigenous story continues on to that this was a land that was colonized by the Spanish, owned by Mexicans, then owned by Texas will claim it, but then Texas still likes to try to claim Colorado. I have the map downstairs, and it's so fun how it used to go straight up, really narrow, all the way to Wyoming. All that way. So that's also part of the story, and so I always kind of say this is very much a story of the land, of this space that is ends up being used by a lot of different types of people for many different reasons. So that's kind of the background that I always like to remind people, is that when we look at the history of the West and early the United States, that this is a history of the Native peoples, and that Native peoples, as they have struggled to maintain their land, struggled to maintain their history and their culture in a space that is constantly being colonized by European powers. And then ultimately the United States seeing this as part of their manifest destiny to expand westward and being guided and by God to do this, but that these people never left. And so that in this region, you have what some historians will refer to as Hispanos, Indo-Hispanos, people that are Nuevo Mexicanos. And so Southern Colorado is really this borderlands region that history and culture of multi-ethnic communities has always existed in this space.
So, and I was just curious. So, when do they actually say, "Hey, we need to start pulling out some of this coal"? Like, when did that start?
1880s to 1890s.
Wow.
And so in 1880, you have Jackson who comes out. It's also that coal is also very much about running the railroad. And so William Jackson Palmer is also invested in building a railroad line from Denver into Santa Fe. And so this is all part of a broader story of westward expansion. And then it's also about who ends up mining this coal. So you have large populations of Hispanos that will mine this coal, and then you'll start seeing a large influx of immigrants coming from across all over the world. In the coal mines of this region, there's 19 to 21 different languages that end up being spoken. And so you'll start seeing a large influx of peoples that might have come through first Ellis Island. You'll have another group that will come through at Galveston, late 1880s, early 1890s, and then you'll continue to see this migration westward. And then those Hispanos people stay there. You'll also see migrations and immigrations of people that are coming through Angel Island in California as well. So this, go ahead.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to kind of just get on the screen here because the train goes right there. In fact, it's just off to the right there because there's a road and then there's a rail.
Yeah, the train is right at that foothills. So if you see that foothills, the train runs right across it. And the train becomes very important to the story because the train is how you transport coal, but it's also how you get people into this region.
And what's so amazing is you want to talk about living history. When you go there, these buildings that were there for this event in 1914, many of them are still there. That's the only one I've got on that page there. But it's truly fascinating just to go there and see that firsthand. And it's almost shocking. It's shocking that it's so accessible and that there's nothing really made of this beyond that marker that I'll show in a little bit. But you can go into these buildings. It's like it's frozen in time, Doctor. It's truly it's amazing the history that is right there, just sitting there rotting away.
Well, and so I think it's important that there was a lot of coal mines throughout southeastern Colorado. So southeastern Colorado, it's producing coal and iron. North of Trinidad, is an old steel mill that there's still some production there today, because the company by the early 1900s is actually owned by a company called the Color Fuel and Iron Company. And it is involved in both horizontal and vertical integration. This is this idea of monopolies that are emerging in the 20th century. And so I always think that the railroad is sort of this connection. It's almost like the vein going through the body of the West and really making that connection.
That's a great way to describe it. Yeah, absolutely.
Both from it's Trinidad, Ludlow, but then it's Pueblo, and then into Denver, and then Denver all the way across the nation. And so I think that the fact that the railroad is still there still serves as that constant marker of really how long this land had been industrialized for. And there's a lot of different old coal mining towns in the region. Most of the roads coming off are old coal mining areas. So there's a place called El Moro that you'll see a sign for. There was an El Moro mine. Walsenburg was actually Camp Walsen. There's a lot of coal mines up from that region. And if you go up some of these canyons, not that I encourage it because there are private landowners in this area. They don't always love people going there. So you don't hear it from me. But in a couple of canyons, you'll see old coke ovens. And then you'll see you'll still see the coal seams on the sides up the mountains. So it's definitely, if you spend a couple of hours there, I live in Virginia now, but as soon as we went to West Virginia, I'm always amazed at how much similarity there is, but definitely being able to see those coal seams.
Yeah. So my son and I, we actually drove, instead of turning around and going back to the interstate like usual, we just kept going past the memorial and just wound our way, down to Lake Trinidad, if anyone's familiar with the area. We took the back road, just straight up gravel, and saw all of these sites that you're talking about. That what are those ovens, though, that you mentioned?
They're coke ovens.
What is that?
So in order to the coal in southern Colorado has to be heated to a certain temperature to make it harder, and then it becomes coke, and coke is what's used to create steel because the coal coming out of the mines is too soft, and so they'll actually produce the coke at the locations. And so they're almost like these beehive shaped brick ovens. And you'll see them most prominently. There's a little bit up the Ludlow or Berwyn Canyon, but there's a place called Cokedale in southern Colorado that has a lot of these still in existence. And I think it's Highway 12, the Highway of Legends, that they still sit along.
Okay, so coal mining never in history has been an easy gig. That has been just, I mean, you read stories and the conditions, and you read the stories of the conditions today. Take us back to over 100 years ago to this region, what a typical day was like, who these laborers were, and who employed them, because that really sets the stage where we go into 1914.
Sure. So initially, it's not a monopoly. The individuals that are owning the companies, there's a lot of different types of smaller companies that are in the region. It will, I think it's Colorado Coal and Iron Company at some point, but it really becomes big in about 1903 when John D. Rockefeller Sr. will purchase the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. And the Rockefeller family will own it from 1903 to about 1942. They'll be the majority stock owners in the company. And then Rockefeller Sr. really lets John D. Rockefeller Jr. handle the operations of the larger corporation. But I really kind of call them as absentee landowners or absentee business owners. Most of it is left to people on the ground. But Rockefeller owned business, and Rockefeller, like he did with U.S. Steel, is very focused on building his wealth, making this a monopoly. Rockefeller is still considered to be one of the wealthiest Americans that ever lived. And so just to kind of give you an idea is that from Rockefeller's perspective, it was both a vertical and a horizontal monopoly. So the idea of a vertical monopoly is that he would own all of the means and production up. So he's going to own the land, he's going to own the coal mines, he's going to own the railroad, he's going to own the steel mill. So this idea of when you think about the means of production, it's all the way up. It's like the way I explain to my students is like, if you own the oil fields, if you own the gas stations, if you know the cars, if you own the railroads, right, you own all of that. And then it's also horizontal, is that he controls all of the coal mines in the region. And so really from 1903 to about 1942, the Rockefeller family through their corporation owns that region. And then their employees are, like I said, coming from 19 to 21 different languages that are spoken there. You see a lot of Greeks, Italians, Slavs, specifically. They had come over really starting in 1808 till mainly about 1910, 1914 is really when you see most of them. A lot of the people that are living in this region might be second or third generation in the United States. So not everybody is like brand new recent immigrants. They are very industrious, hardworking people. They're coming for the American dream. There's a lot of political turmoil from where they're coming from. So they sort of see the United States as a space for them to be able to have greater freedoms and to be able to really build a life for themselves and for their families. You have a lot of them coming in as family units as well. It's not necessarily single men that are coming, or if it's single men that are coming initially, they're coming later. So a lot of larger family units that are in this region.
And that really plays into the tragedy of it all later when we talk about the victims. Okay, so we have a clear monopoly all the way up the food chain.
Yep.
We have workers who, correct me if I'm wrong here, and I may be wrong on this. Did they purposefully put laborers together that didn't speak the same language, or am I just imagining that?
No, they specifically put together workers that didn't speak the same language.
Yeah.
Would believe that then they couldn't unionize.
Right. It would be difficult to organize. Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so when you look at that day-to-day work, is that really you have men that are leaving very early in the morning. It looks different in different camps, but what will end up happening ultimately is that the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company will create mining colonies. And then in these mining colonies, The workers will live in company-owned homes. They will be forced to shop at the company store. They have to go to a company doctor. They are paid in company script, so they're not actually being paid in U.S. dollars. It's company-owned money. They're charged rent in the homes. They're charged in the company store. Either they're not charged, it's not a discount that they're getting. They're paying for the doctor. And so this system is created of debt peonage or wage slavery so that they are basically unable to ever leave any harsh working conditions because the company controls everything. And again, literally down to the railroad. So if they wanted to leave, they would have had to catch the train, but then that train and who controls the train is actually owned by this Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. So then the workday, the men are only paid for what coal they bring out of the mountain. So they're not ever paid for what's called dead work. So in order to go into the mountain, you have to shovel and use a pickaxe going in. Dynamite is used regularly. And so they have to cut the timbers to be able to then build basically the caves or the scaffolding structure with wood to get into the mountain. They're not paid for any of that to actually get in. They're only paid for the coal that they bring out. So that when they're bringing out the coal, the company hires a weighman that is...
this is unbelievable. Please explain this.
So there's a check weighman. So there's a guy at the scales who basically says when they bring the coal out, what is the weight? And most of the times they would say, the check weighman would say, a ton might be 2,500 pounds, not 2,000 pounds. And so they would change what tonnage was. Or they would say there's too much rock in this, so we're either going to reduce what that weight is, or we're just not going to give you any money for it at all. And that was actually one of the demands that happens in the strike of 1913, 1914, is that the workers pushed specifically for hiring their own check weighman because of the way that as the further you go into the mountain, the more unstable it becomes. And so you'll have a lot of industrial accidents. So you'll have mine collapses, you'll have mine explosions. The 1912 and 1913 are considered to be two of the most dangerous years in Colorado in regards to mine accidents. That doesn't include rock falls. My research on Ludlow is actually family based. My great great grandfathers came to Colorado and worked in the mines.
Oh, wow.
One of them actually dies in 1891 from a rock fall at El Morro. And so the number of accidents just continues to increase and increase. And the company really doesn't do anything about it. There are stories of the idea that a donkey was worth more than a worker. Because it was easier to replace a worker than it was to replace a donkey. Their industrial accidents are blamed on the worker rather than company situations. The company doctor, most of the time, if there was an incident where the worker was killed or hurt, then it was usually blamed on the worker. So usually a sun up to sundown, very, very little leisure time. If there is any leisure time, it's usually a Sunday afternoon. A lot of the men will play baseball. So regardless of their background, whether they're from Greece or Italy or anywhere else, baseball becomes very big in coal camps throughout Southern Colorado. It's beautiful, just the fact that these men, when they do have time, this is one of the ways that they're able to come together and communicate with each other.
Yeah. And so they're living in tents.
So they're not living in tents yet. So they're living in company. Okay. They're living in company-owned homes.
Okay.
And then what happens is that because of these dangerous working conditions, and the United Mine Workers are starting to come into the area to start unionizing them. In September of 1913, after all these dangerous accidents, they're having mine workers representatives are having discussions about this. And then one of the mine workers organizers, his name is Gerald Lippiat. He's killed in September of 1913. He's shot out in the streets of Trinidad, specifically by individuals that are anti-union. Pretty much within a couple of days of him being shot, the union will call for a strike. When the workers agree to the strike, and I'll state here, I usually say workers and their families, because there's no way that wives weren't talked to about what's going to happen. And there's no way that women were not very worried about not just their husbands, but their fathers and their brothers and their sons. And so women's involvement in the strike and the support of the strike is very, very important. So when the strike is declared, because they had been living in company-owned houses, they're evicted from their homes. They will leave the canyons. There's a number of different tent colonies that are set up by the United Mine Workers. And so the group specifically at the Ludlow tent colony, they will go and live in these tents starting in September of 1913. They will hold the strike until December of 1914. After the massacre, they will rebuild the tent colony, and then people will continue to live in that region.
Okay. All right. So the trouble is starting in September of 1913, and that's with the murder down in Trinidad, which is, I mean, at the time and even today is the biggest in the area. Right. How far is Trinidad from Ludlow?
It's about 12 miles.
Okay, 12 miles. All right.
And then Trinidad's about 12 miles from the Colorado-New Mexico border.
Right. Okay. So we're in southern Colorado. We're getting coal out of the foothills of the Rockies. The labor conditions are intense and dangerous. How many people were dying? I don't know. I'm sorry to just hit you with this, but do you know off the top of your head, like how frequent were deaths?
There's regular deaths where it's one or two people. One of the biggest mine disasters in the region, I think, is in 1912, and it's the Hastings mine disaster, where you have over 130 men, I think, that are killed. So we're not talking about like just every once in a while a man is being injured. It's significantly more than that. Okay.
So we get to September. Now that we have the murder down in Trinidad of the labor leader, did the strike come before that?
Yeah, immediately after.
You just said it was after. Okay, so now the strike comes. They are now living in tents instead of the company homes, right? And now winter is here, a Colorado winter.
Well, before a Colorado winter, you have the governor of the state, Elias Ammons, who knows what's happening in southern Colorado. And he works very closely with wealthy Denver businessmen. And they are very concerned about what's happening in the coal fields because of this strike. And they get pressure from people like Rockefeller to say, we need to do something about this. And so Governor Elias Ammons will call out the National Guard. The striking miners and their families believe that the National Guard is being called out to protect them. It is very clear that that does not happen. And a man by the name of General John Chase, who has a history of violence against strikers in a previous mining strikes in Colorado. He gets called out and he declares sort of an unofficial martial law at that Ludlow tent colony and throughout southern Colorado. And so then this forces it so that the strikers in that region are then being regularly terrorized by National Guard's troops in that region. And this can be a variety of different things, from playing loud music to setting up a machine gun on an armored car and driving it through so the tent colony is fairly organized, but and so there's actually roads for people to travel through. And so they'll drive that armored car and shoot at different like just random bullets throughout the night. And so that terrorization of that tent colony starts as early as October of 1913. And that's before the winter ever occurs.
Okay. All right. So
the National Guard being called out and then provoking the miners is very key to this story. And so for me, like whenever I hear National Guard has been called out on protesters, strikers, American citizens, I always it scares the crap out of me, because I don't believe this end. Like Ludlow does not end well. Right. And a lot of it is, and I think that this horrible thing for me is that these miners. So what I'll note is the miners were asking to be their strike demands include they want to be paid in dollars, not in company script. Mm-hmm. They want to be able to go to any doctor that they want to be able to go to. They want to be to have their own check weighman. All right. They want the enforcement of Colorado mine safety law. So everything that they are striking for is Colorado law. Okay, so they are literally fighting for the rights that should have been guaranteed to them under Colorado law. And so I think that they really believed that when Ammons called out the National Guard, that it was going to be to protect them.
Okay.
And that does not happen.
All right. And so we're now in October of 1913.
Yep.
And then what begins to happen following that?
So then you have this winter, right, which is the coldest winter on record. If you look at historical documents from the time, you will see feet and feet of snow.
That always seemed to happen in history, like whenever a precursor to really bad things happening is this horrible winter, or a summer with no end. Anyway, continue.
No, so I think this kind of goes to this idea of how bad were the working conditions that these people are willing to stay in the tent colony. And again, it's not just men in the tent colony. It is their wives and it is their children. In order to make more room for themselves and to be able to have an extra space. Because every family is basically assigned to a tent, right? And you're talking in an era really pre-birth control. So you're having a minimum of 3 to 5 children, or 3 to 5 small children, right? And so women are pregnant when they go into the tent colony, women become pregnant in the tent colony. And so a lot of the men will build an extra a tent cellar, right? So a hole underneath these tents to give them additional spaces. And so these might be used as rooms. These might be used as storage space. Archaeologists, those 3 archaeological digs, but there's 2, one in between 1998 and 2002. And what they'll find in these tent cellars are old metal cans that people had been donated from across the United States. One of the tent cellars is believed to be used as a maternity chamber.
So hang on a second. Hang on. So this is fascinating. The tents, they dig down to give it more
canvas tents. They build an additional room because they're coal miners, so they know how to dig.
Yes. Okay.
And then they'll put wood flooring on top of it so that then they don't have to use it all the time. So then So we're talking about highly, highly intelligent individuals, people that have a skilled craft, even though they're seen as unskilled laborers. But if you're building the scaffolding for the mines and you're having to dig into the side of a mountain, you know how to dig a hole to make an additional space for your family. And so not every tent has a tent cellar, but there are a number of them that do.
What's the square footage of a typical tent, and then how much is the extra footage below the earth?
Maybe a 10 by 12, and then underneath it's probably an 8 by 10. It depends upon what that space would be used for. There's still a tent cellar that exists. There's a tent cellar at Ludlow that you can go into. I don't know if you went into it.
Well, it's over there right near the covered
monument. Yeah,
right over there.
So at the base of the monument, there's a metal door, which it's lighter than it used to be. And I think people are always afraid that they can open it or not. But if you open it up, you can walk down the steps of a tent cellar.
I'm going to do that in August because I know what you're talking about, but I never opened it. That's interesting. Okay, cool. So, all righty. Now we're in this nasty winter.
So it's winter of 1913, 1914, worst winter on record in Colorado history.
Gosh, okay. And
so remember, the railroad is controlled by the company.
Everything's controlled.
So in order
the air they breathe is controlled.
So in order to get out, you either have to get permission from the National Guard, who's owned by the company, because the National Guard, the state auditor, his name is Rody Keenahan. After a certain point, he says Colorado State cannot pay for this. And so they will do what's called insurrection bonds. And so those insurrection bonds are mainly bought by Denver businessmen, and this is what is paying for the calling out of those National Guard troops. I'd also note the National Guard's troops might have been company guards, but there's also Baldwin Felts agents that are pulled into the National Guard, and Baldwin Felts agents had already been in southern Colorado in order to kind of deal with controlling the coal mines.
Okay, so this is basically I mean, I'm kind of twisting it a little bit here. This is almost like having a social credit score. In other words, they're not letting anybody on those trains, right? I mean, it's just, you're there. You're stuck, correct? or was it how feasible, how affordable was it to be like, you know what? And again, it's very difficult in 2025 to put my mindset into 1914. But let's just say you're so fed up with working conditions, you can't stand the way that your family is having to live, and you say, you know what? I'm going to go find my American dream somewhere else. How difficult was it to afford to get on the train and get the hell out of there? And then even then, where would you go?
Right. So there's nowhere to go. But I think the other thing is, so there's a story of a woman named Mary Petrucci. And Mary Petrucci, she has a son who's sick. And she tries to get him out of Ludlow, and they don't allow her to get on the train, and the boy ends up dying. There's a beautiful song by the name of Ton Breeding called "The Ballad of Mary Petrucci," and he talks about the fact that Mary is not allowed to get on the train to save her sick son. Wow. And then there's other children that will also die in the tent colony because they're unable. They can't go to company doctor because the company's not going to help them, but they can't get out the train out of Trinidad to be able to take their children to the doctor.
Okay.
And we're not talking about a large distance. Like I said, about 10 to 12 miles.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So, is it time to get to April of 1914 or not
quite yet? So I'll remind you that they're being terrorized. There's a woman by the name of Mary Harris or Mother Jones, who's a United Mine Workers organizer, but she also goes and organizes all across the United States. She's imprisoned in Walsenburg because of her fighting against the National Guard. In protest, you will see women from across the region who will march through the streets of Trinidad. The National Guard comes and tries to disperse the women. The order, I think it's from General Chase, is that they need to ride down the women, and the women get attacked by the National Guard. There are stories of women getting slashed with bayonets when they're running away to escape it. So, like I said, I think the women's part of this is a very important part because it doesn't matter. It's not the fact that it's just striking men, is that women are being targeted as well. And then you hit April. And April is complicated because a lot of the National Guard's forces have been pulled back because they can't afford them. I would say that in the tent colony, there is, even though they're from different ethnic groups and different languages, that music becomes very important to the tent colony, a lot of community gatherings. On April 19th, it's Greek Easter. So the miners, the strikers all come together and celebrate Greek Easter. And that there's a group, they have a baseball game.
Yeah, I find this fascinating. The day before the massacre, there was a baseball game where laborers and members of the security detail are together.
Yeah, so some of the National Guardsmen and the miners or strikers now at this point are playing together. There is a group of 3 or 4 of them that disrupt the National Guard. And it's unclear again if they're National Guard and if they are Baldwin Felts agents. So there's a belief that there are specific instigators in this group of National Guardsmen.
Yeah,
so
said something pretty ominous, right?
Yeah. So they come in, there's a group of 3 or 4 men that they kind of stop the baseball game and tell them, you've had your fun today. We will have our roast tomorrow. And so people go to bed on Greek Easter, April 19th. They wake up in the morning. It's unclear exactly what happens first, but shots are fired. Then they're returned. And so then there becomes really this all-out battle at the Ludlow tent colony of now the strikers and their families are trying to leave. The National Guard is attacking the tent colony. By later in the day, the National Guard will pour kerosene on the tents and light the tent colony on fire.
Now, do we know why they chose, all right, today's the day, April 20th. Were they just tired of the strike? How long had the strike been going on?
So the strike's been going on since September. Okay, so I think they're tired of it, but it's not clear who had encouraged those specific men to come forward. Right. The other thing that I would say is that these National Guardsmen and these policies of National Guardsmen, these were also the Colorado militia that 50 years before at Sand Creek had also attacked Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. And so there is
that's another deep dive altogether.
Yeah, but there's a culture that exists
Yep.
among Colorado militia, Colorado National Guard.
That's true.
Of setting fire to encampments, practices of National Guard and of the military in the 1860s and in the 1870s, especially towards Native peoples, was one of destroying them in their homes.
And J.D. Rockefeller himself, right? He said,
So Rockefeller's asked during congressional hearings what he thinks about this, and he says they're willing to die for it. Basically, I'm willing to kill them about it. I think that it's a good principle that I have. J. Rockefeller is very happy with what he feels like he's been doing. They know that the strike is occurring, but they're not doing a lot of things to try to quell the violence. I will bring up the railroad here, though. So one of the things that happens is at some point during the fighting, the train will come from Trinidad. It will stop on the tracks. And by stopping on the tracks, that will allow a large number of people that have been in the tent colony to come across and get back up into the mountains and into the arroyo. And if you go to the Ludlow, every year there's a memorial at Ludlow, usually the third weekend in June. And the train will always go by, usually sometime between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock, and they will blow their horn.
Wow.
Even today, the train will still go by and blow their horn. And so it's kind of this acknowledgement of the railroad guys know what the history of that region is. They know how important the railroad was to saving these people.
Wow. Because, I mean, that should be next weekend, right? Wow.
It's on the 22nd.
Okay. Yeah. So, okay, let me back up for a second. I had a thought that I wanted to ask you about. Oh, my goodness. It'll come back to me, I'm sure. But, okay, so we're now on April 20th, and oh gosh, man, I bet it was an awesome question, Doctor. I'm sure it was the greatest question.
Well, I'll tell you two really cool stories. I don't think they're horrible stories, right?
Yeah.
So there's this guy named Louis Tikas. He's a Greek guy, right? First generation immigrant. He is the main organizer. He tries to go to leaders of the National Guard to stop them from doing this. They end up hitting him in the head with a rifle and shooting him in the back. His body is left along the train tracks for 3 days, just his dead body lying there. There's another guy who's trying to help him out. His name is Charlie Costa or Pascual Costa as well, gets killed. There's fighting. There's shots being fired across this tech colony. This 12-year-old boy, Frank Snyder, gets shot, gets caught in the gunfire. So it's this almost like they're trapped. They're trying to get out. Any attempt to get out, there's no way that they're going to make peace with the National Guard. It's horrible.
Yeah. How armed were the miners, by the way?
They're not poorly armed. So there's questions about how much guns that they actually had. They're not anywhere close to the National Guard. There's no machine gun, right? Okay. Anything like that. There's a guy in Southern Colorado. He still has his grandfather's rifle from what happened. But they're not usually automatic weapons. These would have been like hunting rifles more so.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
So I think what I think is the saddest part of the story is that before the tents are set aflame, there are 4 women and 11 children that will take refuge in a tent cellar. And one of the women, her name is Serelina Costa, she's actually pregnant at the time. The question is whether she's 9 months pregnant or whether she's full-term pregnant. They will seek refuge in these tents. When the National Guard sets the tents aflame, you end up having 2 of these women suffocate and 11 children suffocate. And so this is what will actually bring it to the attention of the national news media and the president.
Okay, so
this is what makes it a massacre, the killing of these women and children.
It feels like Waco, honestly. It feels like what happened there as far as women and children being burnt alive. And I remember my question now. So it's 1914. We don't have TV. We don't have radio. And I think you just kind of walked into my question with you talking about now the news media hears about this. Now the President Wilson hears about this. And that's what I wanted to ask you. Is this fog of war, being that it was before mass communications, really, Do you think that, and again, this is speculation, but if this standoff had been happening for 6 months and it was on the news every night, do we think it would have gotten to this point? Or do you think the fact that it was so remote, again, speculation here, the fact that it was so remote and you didn't see images, you didn't get news in real time, do you think that's why people like Rockefeller felt like they could get away with stuff like this?
No, I don't think the media really matters. I think it still happens today when we see this. I mean, look at the news, literally look at the news stories that have been on our TV for months.
Okay.
Right. And then and maybe, but I think people think it's still far away. Right. But I mean, I remember years ago, there were those 33 Chilean miners that were stuck. And I think we were all glued to the TV, whether they were going to get it or not. And they got out. Right. The next week, there was a mine disaster in West Virginia. I think over 100 miners were killed. It was like a little blurb in the news. I think maybe one of the issues is the 24-hour news cycle. Definitely, it's almost like some of this gets buried because we get desensitized from watching it.
That's interesting. So we've gone from no coverage to oversaturation to where stuff gets just lost. That's interesting. Well,
and I think it's about what do we think matters to us. One of the things with the Ludlow Massacre is that immediately afterwards, because what happens is the survivors go and basically share the stories, and it's really the killings of these women and children. And so it spreads throughout southern Colorado, and then there's a 10-day war that starts happening, so that miners all over will start pulling up their arms.
That's what I wanted to ask you. What all transpired then?
Well, and then the railroad is still running, and so you'll have passenger rail that is going through this. The tech colony is still burning, right? And then these bodies are laying next to the railroad tracks, and the people that are traveling on this passenger rail are not lower class individuals; they're middle and upper class peoples, and so they get to Denver, and the news reports start getting to Denver, and people's eyewitness accounts of this, and so it's really a lot of progressive women in Denver that really start pushing people in Washington, D.C. And then Upton Sinclair hears about it in New York City, and he will start protesting, and he will go to the gates of the Rockefeller mansion and demand there to be some level of accountability. Years later, he'll write a book called King Coal. And so I think it's really that 10-day war afterwards that Woodrow Wilson will actually call out federal troops to squelch the violence. And so this National Guard, the federal troops, this all becomes a very complicated situation. And then I think the tent seller is horrific. The two women that survive, one is a woman by the name of Mary Petrucci. She loses all three of her children. So this is the same woman whose son had already died from not being able to get on the train. And then most of these children are all under the age of 7 or 8. You have a lot of them that are 2 or 3. But she lives. She'll end up going and doing a ton of congressional hearings and speeches across the United States. She comes back to Colorado at some point because she's missing her husband. She and her husband they have more children, and she'll name some of them after the ones that are killed in the massacre. And that family continues to tell their story. There's another woman who lives. Her name is Alcarita Pedregon. There's very little that is known about her afterwards. We're only now discovering more about her descendants. So I have a conversation with her granddaughters next week.
Oh, wow.
Just really like, what was the story? At this point, one of the things that they told me was that their grandmother and their grandfather, there was one surviving child who was 2 years old. He didn't even go into the tent cellar. But he lived the rest of his life with no siblings, and they grew up with no cousins or no uncles and no aunts. And so they talked about the fact that for the Pedregon family, they stayed poor. And the mother and the son always wondered, how have we stayed poor when Rockefeller still has all of the money in the world? And then there's a woman who also dies. Her name is Patria Valdez, and the naming is unclear, but her name on the monument is Patria. But she dies. All of her children die. We know nothing about any of her family members. Her husband is killed 2 months later. He's looking for a new wife. And he gets shot in the front yard of a man's home who doesn't want him dating his daughter. It's just, I've been looking up stuff on him. But then the other woman who dies is Catalina Costa. And Catalina, she was the woman who was pregnant. The family story is that when they found her body, she had bayonet wounds in her back and she was holding her baby in her arms.
Oh my gosh. I will.
Catalina, all of her children die. And then her husband is also killed. He's one of the men that's killed when Luis Tikas is killed.
That is a constant refrain, being shot or stabbed in the back on a lot of these massacres in history. There's the monument there at Ludlow, and I guess my question is the land today. I mean, it's a ghost town.
So this is all privately owned.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Who owns this land today? Because I mean, guilty. I hop the fence and I go into these buildings and I take a look around and I'm just, it's stunning when you stand in these buildings just to think of what happened there a century ago.
Yeah, so that land is owned by private landowners. The land around the tent colony, around the monument, that's owned by the United Mine Workers. They bought it a few years later. I think it's 40 acres in all. And then they erected the monument in 1918. I will note that the monument was destroyed in around 2003. It was during a steel strike in Colorado, in Pueblo, and it's believed that it was anti-union individuals. They cut off the heads of the man and the woman, and then cut off the arm. It will grit national attention. Eventually, the mine workers will work with local elected officials, and Ludlow will be declared a National Historic Landmark, which happened in 2009. It's one of the only National Historic Landmarks that the National Park Service has some. They are able to apply for grants, and they work collaboratively with the National Park Service, but it's continued to be owned by the mine workers. And mine workers have a memorial event every year and have, except for COVID, since 1915.
Wow, that's okay. So obviously more people are learning about it, I guess, probably through your efforts, no doubt. All right. So how many victims total were there over this 10-day period?
There's 25 on that day. And then the question over the 10-day period is there's a couple, probably 150, but it's still unclear what the numbers are because they're usually inflated.
Okay.
But I think there was maybe one or two National Guard that are killed on the day of. And then those numbers, like there's a couple of passerbys that ended up being killed. Again, it's a multi-ethnic group, right? You have Greeks, you have Italians, you have these Hispanos or Hispanics that are living in this region. And that is kind of one of the consistent things about this workforce. It's immigrant, and it is people who are ethnic minorities in the workforce.
Okay, so a 10-day war happens, and what gets it stopped when Wilson sends in the federal troops?
Send in federal troops. The mine workers will clean up as much as they possibly can. They will cement the tent cellar where the women and children died. It's known as the death pit. That's the tent cellar that still exists there today.
And they are still buried in there?
Nope, they are buried in a Trinidad cemetery. Most of them are unknown graves. There's no markers to the grave. Unless family members years later put the grave markers there. Luis Tikas is I think he's in the Masonic cemetery, so they're not even buried in the same place. But the tent cellar, there's a Woody Guthrie song called "The Ludlow Massacre," and he sings about the tent cellar being cemented up. The mine workers in 2022, they did an archaeological dig around the tent cellar and restored the tent cellar to they added some ventilation. The idea is that it will still exist in 100 years. And so they've been amazing stewards of this property. They just received a National Park Service grant about a year ago to work with community members to see about long-term preservation and expanded interpretation, which they will probably not get another grant for because that funding will all potentially have already been cut in the future.
So, okay. You have the strike, you have the massacre, you have the war. Okay. What is the fallout there? I want to.
So after the war, they're still on strike.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Yeah. So
they're still on strike. They're on strike until December of 1914, and then the strike will end. So we always say this as like they don't win the battle, but there is more tension. Go ahead.
No, here's my question: if I'm a miner there and I'm part of the strike and the massacre happens and the war happens, people's they stuck around.
Where are they going to go?
That's exactly what
Where
I
are
was
they
going to say.
going to
I was
go?
about
Where are
to come
they going
back
to
to
work?
what I said earlier. Yeah.
Okay, so they
My word.
basically because where are you going to go?
Where are you going to go?
Right? Because any large corporations at this time are going to follow similar practices. You have to have the money to get out. You don't have the money to get out unless the mine workers are going to help you. The mine workers, so there is some migration out, but they are going to Price, Utah is a place where a lot of these coal miners end up going because there's another mine in that region. So they're skilled labor in coal mining. You will see some people that will end up moving up to Denver. Some people will move to California, but it's usually within a couple, one generation. It's not always immediately because they don't have the resources to go. Or if they had other family members that had left earlier. So the Costa family, the extended family had left before the massacre, and they had gone up to Walsenburg, and then they completely move out to California. But most of them end up staying in the region. And then like your Hispanic, like my family stays in the region, still in the region because that's where they're from.
Yeah.
But it's really not until after World War II that you'll see this large migration out because many of them will go to war. And then when they come back, they'll go and work in the steel mill.
And I may have this wrong. It feels like the first, please correct me if I have this wrong. It feels like the first public relations reclamation project came out of Ludlow with J.D. Rockefeller.
Yeah, so after the massacre, there are congressional hearings in which both Rockefeller Jr. and Rockefeller Sr. are grilled, and then you have survivors who also testify. So it's not like it's just the Rockefeller family, and the mine workers will pay to bring them out and testify in these congressional hearings. The National Guard also gets put on trial. It ends up in no convictions. Rockefeller Jr. will hire this guy, Ivy Lee, and he'll hire Mackenzie King. Mackenzie King will later become the Prime Minister of Canada. Ivy Lee is considered to be the father of public relations. And then what he will do is he will work with Ivy Lee and Mackenzie King to put together a great PR campaign, which is focusing on this idea of a company union. And so CF&I is really one of the very first corporations in the United States that will put together a company union. Rockefeller spends millions and millions of dollars, has a whole plan that has a focus on social and industrial betterment. He will then send it out to corporations and unions throughout the United States. And then he goes to Southern Colorado to basically proselytize his plan. He goes and he tells a bunch of because the CF&I doesn't just control the coal mines, it also owns the steel mill. And so he will go to the people at the steel mill and he'll go to the different camps and he will say he has this three-legged stool philosophy. It's like, it's you and I and all of these other pieces of the puzzle. But he basically says, I'm just like you. I'm a stock owner, right? And so I have invested in this companies in the same way that you do, but I don't have any more power or control than you have. And so being part of the company union is in your best interests, which ultimately with the company still being in control, they picked who their employee representatives were. Rockefeller Jr. in 1918 will actually come to the memorial. He'll drive out in the car with one of his friends and with their wives. He gets to the memorial and the United Mine Workers president, Frank Hayes, meets him at the car and says, I can't guarantee your safety, so I would suggest that you leave. Rockefeller basically tries to still come forward and he repeats again, and eventually Rockefeller will turn around. So he really tries to say, like, I get it. I'm trying to make life better for all of you. He'll also work with the YMCA, and they will build different YMCAs throughout these coal camps in Colorado. And that becomes really his push towards social and industrial betterment.
You know, and I wish I had found a video and rewatched it here. Years ago, I watched this video about the aftermath of Ludlow and Rockefeller and how, like, I mean, it was a PR campaign, like you said there. And it was, I think one of the videos they made, it was the first time, maybe the only time that they had Rockefeller smiling. And it was just like, look, I'm just like you, and I am a happy man. I mean, it's just the stupidest thing, but yet it was effective, wasn't it? My gosh.
I think it's effective across the nation. In Southern Colorado, people see him as he's the villain. When he comes to kind of proselytize his work, he comes more than once, but he tries to dance with the women and they refuse, because they know who he is and what he did. But a lot of the people that will align themselves with a company and become company management really see him as being this amazing innovator, and really someone who they see as a champion of working men. But that's from management perspective. That's not necessarily from worker perspective.
So is it fair, when looking at the history of labor unions in America, is it fair to draw a line in 1914 and look at it as the labor movement in America before Ludlow and the labor movement after?
I don't usually do that, because I think World War I really complicates things, because you have your 1917, 1918 Alien and Sedition Act. And then I think it's about the longevity of unions, right? And so, like, for me, when you look at like the AFL-CIO, because you'll see the rise at this time frame. So I think for the mine workers, this really puts them on the national stage. I see it more as this becomes the roots of what's asked for in 1935 with the passage of the National Labor Relations Board and with the Wagner Act. And so the mine, I think, because labor unions are so, like, they're so different sometimes, because you'll also see in other places like the industrial workers of the world, right? And you'll see some labor unions that are much more anti-immigrant communities, whereas the United Mine Workers is not. And so I don't necessarily draw a strong line for all of labor, but I would say for the mine workers, it is very clear, and how it's usually labeled by the current president, Cecil Roberts, is this is the mine workers' Gettysburg. And this is that fight where they are literally fighting for their constitutional rights. And so this becomes a rallying cry for them. And at least in southeastern Colorado, this is why there's an annual memorial even until today, because everyone comes and gathers, right? And it can be, sometimes it's 50 people. During the 100th commemoration, there was over 1,000 people. I think in 2 weeks, there'll be probably 150 people. And they are descendants of people that were killed. They are descendants of people that worked in the region. There is still mine workers from Price, Utah, who come, from Gallup, New Mexico, who come. The Navajo Nation always comes. And so I think that's the marker, is that it is clear of, if you're not union, what can happen to you. And a lot of it is the conversations about that. Why do we have workman's comp? Why do we have 8-hour work days, right? And that much of this is because of the sacrifices that were made at the Ludlow Massacre.
And that's kind of what I was thinking, that it kind of lined up with that transition as far as more, I guess, workers' rights.
Yeah.
That time in
I think
history.
just World War I complicates things.
Okay.
But it's really, at least for the mine workers, there's a line that's drawn, and this is sacred land.
And I'm going to be very annoying with this question, but it's kind of bugging me here. You mentioned that the third weekend in June is when the train does the whistle thing.
So it does it all the time, but you really hear it that third weekend of June.
So why is it not April 20th then? Like, I'm just trying to figure out what's the significance.
You ever been to Colorado in April?
Oh, okay.
The only way you're guaranteed that the memorial is going to happen is if it's in June.
Okay. I got you. That makes sense now. I was trying to figure it out. See, I have to ask these questions because otherwise I'm
it's changed. So it used to be closer to Memorial Day. When I was on the 100th Commission, there was an event on April 20th, but the mine workers usually do it in June because they're guaranteed it's not going to snow.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Because Colorado gets you in April. You think it's all nice and wonderful, and then
no, I've lived in western Nebraska. I know what it's like out there in the.
And it's just evolved. It used to be earlier, it used to be around Memorial Day, and then it was earlier in June, and so this has kind of been that. And then anyone who's coming out to speak, they're not going to get stuck in the snow.
Yeah, that's cool. Very good.
Yeah.
Now, so
and no one fights. So in 2014, it was actually the third week in May, I think it was.
Okay.
But now
Very
it's
good.
late in June.
So, okay. I mean, you have covered this topic. How long have you been researching this? Because, like I said, I stumbled upon this marker, and I'm so glad it was there. I didn't find anything out about this until 2020.
So as a professional researcher, I started writing my dissertation in 2005, and I actually tried to not write about Ludlow. My research, I wanted to look at southeastern Colorado World War II veterans. And so I was living in Texas. I was actually living in Lubbock, Texas at the time, and I would make the drive up to Pueblo to do my research. And every time I would pass by Ludlow. And I was so mad when I realized that I couldn't write about World War II unless I wrote about Ludlow. And I didn't want to write about Ludlow because I think I felt like at least the history has been written extremely well by a man by the name of Thomas Andrews. He wrote a book called Killing for Coal. And so I didn't feel like there was a lot of need to do more. The longer I've researched it now, it's really about the women's stories that I do research on and about the descendant stories. So what's the memory of the massacre? But Ludlow was one of my first field trips. My family actually lived in southeastern Colorado. I went to elementary school at this town called Honey, Colorado. I think it's maybe 10 minutes from the massacre site. I don't know if it was because our teacher really cared about Ludlow or if it was a cheap bus. They had to pay a little bit for gas. And I remember that when I was writing my dissertation, there was a family reunion in Trinidad in 2005. And we all showed up at my great uncle Vidal Montoya's house, and he wasn't there. Because he'd gone to Ludlow.
Wow.
And so that really stuck with me of how important Ludlow is to this older generation in Colorado, especially because a lot of the workplace gains that were made for coal miners was because of the massacre. And there used to be, there was Ludlow days where the mine workers would bring people to the memorial site. They would do long walks to it. So it became really important, at least in the history of southeastern Colorado.
And you're working on 2 books?
2 books.
Okay. Well.
2 books, museum exhibits, focus groups, figuring out how to continue to tell the story of Ludlow so that you would go to the massacre site and there'd be more interpretive panels, probably a bigger museum exhibit, and then hopefully a mobile app with a QR code that you could just click that on and open up to a whole set of resources everywhere from songs to documentaries to resources page, and then hopefully link you back to oral histories and to archaeological artifacts.
And you're doing all of this from Virginia, right?
I go west every summer, and I have a colleague that I wrote the book with that we meet once a week. And so Zoom. So COVID was good for virtual spaces. And then as a professor, I teach the American West, and my students just did a class on Ludlow this past semester. It helps me to really think about Ludlow within a broader U.S. context. And I think in Southern Colorado, more people have heard of it. So in this part of the country, I'm constantly reminded people do not know about this, and that the story is just as important as I think that it is.
Sure.
And it's really helped me to connect the international component of the story, where these people have come from. And so my colleague and I are doing a lot of work on saying we need to tell the story not just of the massacre, but of the generations before, and how did we get to Ludlow, but also the generations after, and what do those families do with the story of Ludlow. And I think that's been very rewarding, because some family members knew about Ludlow, so people living today, and we found people who they didn't know. And so they're descendants of people who were killed, and they don't know unless they basically find a breadcrumb at some point. Like I know of a woman, her father died, and that's when she realized that her uncle was killed at the Ludlow Massacre. She knew nothing about him until after her father died.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you for your work on this and for bringing history to life and making sure that this story, no matter how dark it is, in America's story, that it does get told. Dr. Fawn Amber Montoya, James Madison University, the Ludlow Massacre. Get out there off of I-25 if you can. Just if you're driving up to Denver or down from Denver, it's right there just to the west of the interstate. I mean, you see it from the interstate. And it's such a moving experience just to go there and read the names and everything. So thank you for your time today, Doctor. Anything else you want to throw out there for us before we part?
No, I would check out the YouTube. It's called The Ballad of Mary Petrucci. And then there's a couple Rocky Mountain PBS. There's one called The Ludlow Experience. And I have a C-SPAN 3, which is a podcast or a video that you can watch on it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow we'll do the Friday live stream right here at 3 p.m. Eastern. Rebecca will be back. Brad will be here. We'll have some fun. And then a week from today, next week's deep dive, Operation Gladio. What was the CIA up to after World War II? Okay, kids, thank you so much. I hope y'all have a great day. Be safe out there.